In the before times, when I was but a wee lad, one of my favourite games was Burnout 3 Takedown. And rightly so, it's a great game with the whoosh, bang, you know. For the first time, I found myself actually enjoying a racing game, because in this one you got to smash the other drivers into the walls, leaving behind unrecognisable piles of chrome. And speaking of unrecognisable piles of chrome, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me finish this opener first. On a completely unrelated note though, this video will contain pretty heavy spoilers for the series in question. I mean, not Burnout 3. Hard to spoil that. Unrecognisable piles of chrome. One of the things that really stood out to me in Burnout 3 was its licensed soundtrack, and that was largely owed to, of course, Franz Ferdinand's This Fire, which I loved every time it popped up. And given there were about 15 songs on the soundtrack total, it popped up quite a bit. So imagine my surprise after hearing about Cyberpunk Edgerunners and its surprising quality given the initial state of the game it was attached to, and then imagine my surprise multiplied tenfold when I went onto this very website to watch the opening, only to find out that Mr. Ferdinand and his friends had rolled back into town and provided the backing track with that very same song. What fun, I thought as I watched the heavy-handed symbolism of all the characters all literally falling to pieces as the pace of their acceleration outpaced what their bodies could tolerate until it ended on the protagonist getting shot in the head point blank with a big, nasty gun. It's worth pointing out before I get into that any farther that I hadn't played 2077 at the time. I'd seen enough overhyped disasters in the making to know that I'd probably want to wait for a while after launch, and more pressingly, I knew my graphics card at the time would have struggled to handle it. I wasn't chromed up enough, you might say. So right from the jump, I felt a bit of a kinship with this adaptation, and that's not just because I moonlight as a toaster oven. Now hold on, I didn't think that through. I moonlight as a Falcon X.
I love this! Falcon X! Owen? Enough!
Not knowing then what I know about the setting now, that no stories in Night City end happily and everything sucks basically all of the time, this was actually unknown territory for me going in beyond, you know, general cyberpunk genre osmosis, Blade Runner, and that live-action MS-DOS adventure game that had Christopher Walken in it. Ripper. Any Ripper fans out there?
Going into interrogation, Brannon. You know, little police work. How's the coffee, Sarge? Nice and hot.
Cyberpunk future's bad. Corpos view human lives as bargaining chips at best and disposable non-entities at worst. The whole world is a giant city and it all looks like Kowloon. Big billboards have geishas telling us how cool it is to live on the moon, all of that good stuff. Cyberpunk. But I'd never touched the game or the tabletop upon which it's based, so in a very real sense, Edgerunners was my first exposure to Night City. And what an exposure it was, huh? Unrecognisable piles of chrome. One of the big reasons why I checked this out beyond the opening is of course the design of the character Lucy, but the reason I actually intend to talk about to save face is that the production was headed up by one studio, Trigger, whose work I've adored and harshly criticised in equal measure before. I made a review of Darling in the Franxx, it got obliterated by copyright claims, join the Patreon if you want to see it, it's privately hosted, but you'll have to take my word for it that I have a long history with Trigger. Rather, I have a long history with them, not vice versa. I don't think Trigger's out for my blood personally. I mean, maybe Mr. Imaishi is, who can say. The one thing I've always maintained about Trigger, they're at their best when they're working on series under which they have relatively limited control of adaptations and the sort, for which I think you can also readily look towards the Gridman show and Dungeon Meshi as other examples. This is gonna sound kind of harsh, giving Mr. Imaishi another reason to hunt me down for sport, but they've long struck me as a kind of George Lucas type institution where when left with full authorial control, they quickly go off the rails, but when restrained by having to adapt pre-existing material, they have a lot of focused creative energy. Even beyond that, nobody makes shows that move like the ones Trigger puts out there. Nobody. I think their really specific style of animation brings a flavor with it that I both wish we saw more of and I'm supremely grateful exists in the first place. You know, past a certain point. More than that though, or at least in addition to it, Trigger's shows always display a flair for the cinematic. They often go for some really unique angles to display any given action or sequence, and that's certainly still true here. Why frame a scene in a traditional flat shot when you can frame it with a camera flying wildly through space after all? The answer is of course that it's much harder to do, but hey, Trigger does it anyway. Worth appreciating. The series is made much more compelling for being framed the way it is. It also leans into that Western aesthetic that Trigger so often seems to gun for. Their style always struck me as being like if a traditional anime studio got fused with one of those buckwild 90s Cartoon Network / Nicktoons studios in maybe a Jeff Goldblum-esque teleportation incident. Edgerunners certainly has that trademark Trigger cartoonishness, but it brought with it a hyper-violence that I wasn't expecting with how blunt a lot of it is. It's fitting for the setting, and it works surprisingly well. The action is very well put together in general. It's over the top and wacky enough that it works as an anime more than it would as a live action piece, but it's not so far gone that it's hard to take what's going on seriously. It's a delicate balance, and it's one the studio has failed to meet in the past, but they pull it off with aplomb here. As far as production quality goes, I'd say this is one of Trigger's more consistently successful series, so let's continue to talk about it. Edgerunners is a show about a young man called David Martinez who can't fit into the upper-class school his mother's working night and day to pay his tuition for, and for whom, like so many of us, the pathetic tragedy of life has only just begun to unfold. At the nadir of his depression, he meets a woman called Lucy and decides that it's time for him to become a big honcho in the criminal underworld because he thinks she's wildly attractive and wants to kiss her on the mouth. I mean, can you blame the guy? Come on now. Christ, help me! After things break bad, as they so often seem to, David finds a really cool new spine, and after augmenting his body with it, David can now both edge and run simultaneously, unlike that dude sitting on the stairs with the auto blow. So begins his meteoric race to both the top of the criminal underworld and Lucy's bedroom. Unless you don't think something bad might happen, do you? So I know I already absolutely have, but just to make certain we're on the same page going into this bit, I'm gonna spoil the series from here on out, as in talk directly about what happens in the end. Of course, you know, as if the opening didn't do that for us, Edgerunners has less an episode count and more a ticking clock. Minutes to midnight and all that. Now, that's certainly not to say I knew exactly what was going to happen, or indeed when. I just kind of think maybe they could have been a bit more vague in the opening. It's not like in JoJo, where if you know the references, you go, oh, that spoils the whole thing. It literally just shows David's body falling apart until he gets shot in the head. One would have to be a profoundly dedicated optimist to look at that and say, hey, maybe he makes it out okay. You could, I suppose, read it as a metaphor for his Icarian flight, and it is. But, you know, it doesn't take too much artistic license to read between the lines here, given they're roughly the size of the equator of the Earth. Before it begins, we know how it ends. Halo Reach and all that. I'm realizing now that I refer to Halo Reach a lot, which is funny, because I like ODST more, but what I really mean, and what I should probably be saying instead, is that the show is full tilt, strong sad, each day we die a little more, man better act somebody out and out fatalistic. You know what they say, all Halo Reachian stories are fatalistic, but not all fatalistic stories are Halo Reachian. The opening spells it out for us, and if that slipped by our notice because we were French kissing the maid, or perhaps we were distracted by a passing flying saucer, the first few episodes are effectively the entire series in microcosm. It happened before, it's happening again. It's less like watching a car crash and more like being told that an oncoming car is going to crash. At no point do they give us hope that the car won't crash, but over the course of the series you start to really like the car and all the car's friends, and you hope against hope that the car might survive, or at the very least might crash in a really cool, sexy way that would make for incredible ratings. I admit that metaphor ran away from me around 13 words in there. But you know what? The emotional beats are remarkably effective, even if the incoming tragedy couldn't be more obviously headed right towards us if it were written on the side of a missile fired straight at us, or I guess 90 degrees away from us in favor of the writing. As the man thought shortly before the grizzly bear pounced, I don't think it's an act of pessimism to say I can see where this is going. I'm not saying this like I'm some genius level academic to whom the machinations of plot are readily unwrappable. Christ knows it's the opposite, but it almost couldn't be clearer what happens. It's intentional that we know this is a doomed story. David's mother isn't long for this world from the moment she steps on screen, and we know that from both context and cliche. David abuses technology he received from dubious sources in an attempt to tilt the odds in his favor and make his way through a situation he wouldn't be able to get through otherwise, even though it deeply hurts the people he cares about. Is it any surprise we see that pattern repeat? It really is a tragedy, and even without knowledge of how grim a lot of cyberpunk can be, it doesn't take a master's degree in film studies to see this stuff cyclical. He's not a guy who can break free from the pattern. He spends the opening few moments of the series reliving the final moments of a cyber psycho gunning people down. Where else could it go? The past catches up to you. Everyone in Night City is running from something. Unfortunately, Night City never stops running right after you. It's like a Duracell battery, and instead of powering your remote control, it powers being incredibly miserable all of the time. And the series is still more than tragic, it's emotional. A lot of people point to the montage of David and Lucy having fun on the moon set to Rosa Walton's I Really Want to Stay at Your House as an emotional high point, and I do readily admit love that sequence and how it ties into the ending. It's all exceptionally well considered and produced, but it is a fatalistic, sad story, tonally. Okay, I admit that's not my most insightful takeaway. We don't start enough feel-good family comedies with point-blank headshots in their opening sequences after all, but I did find, as the series wound on, that it was increasingly hard to invest in the characters when I knew how their story was going to end. I don't know if that's a result of them being too heavy-handed, or if that's a result of me spending too much time thinking and not enough time feeling, but I spent a lot of the last few episodes waiting for the other shoe to drop, and as a result, those episodes were, for me, definitely less impactful than the first few. And I don't mean to say they're bad as a result of that. The show stops being about victories and starts being about trying and failing to endure loss after loss after loss at around the midpoint, and it's written in such a way that they know we know things aren't going to get any better, which I understand is kind of the general setting, if not the genre's entire thing. So again, it doesn't detract from the narrative, but I was emotionally prepared for the finale when I watched the opening on YouTube for the first time. If anything, it makes David's desperate last victory, however Pyrrhic, a heroic moment of triumph for him because he achieved some small victory against Night City itself. Not even Arasaka, the conglomerate of nasty suits that are responsible for a lot of the awful things that happen to David and his crew, are villains. Night City really is the villain here, but Arasaka definitely are awful, don't get it twisted. Trigger did a really good job here making the setting feel appropriately grimy and awful. The aforementioned guy with the jerk-off machine on the stairs, the overcrowding, the discrepancy between the low-income areas and the high-income areas, that's all prime background detail that I imagine was a lot of extra hard work that really pays off. Like when CD Projekt Red said take Rebecca out, and Trigger said, no, you don't understand, this is crucial, and hey, it turns out they were right there too, but they really do a fantastic job of making Night City seem like a machine that chews people up and spits them out into unrecognized. Okay, that one risks being run into the ground at this point, sorry. You see legitimate reasons for David to want to keep augmenting himself, and the constant threat of cyberpsychosis David undergoes as he increasingly chromes himself up is mirrored by the people undergoing symptoms of it around him, but it's also practically forced on him by his environment. He makes a desperate, stupid gamble, and it pays off. People repeatedly tell him he can't succeed unless he gets better augments, and without his Sandevistan-powered time dilation, he'd be long dead. So they're not exactly wrong either. He needs to risk destroying himself to succeed, but he can only roll those dice so many times. It's almost terrifying watching him get worse and worse, knowing how it will go. Imagine a world where Kojima wrote a more direct turning into a villain arc for Big Boss in Peace Walker and Metal Gear Solid 5, and you've got that omnipresent tension of knowing how it will end whilst being unnerved by how bad it must have to go to get him there. It is, in pretty much every sense, Icarian. David's arrogance in believing he's better at handling the Sandevistan and his higher tolerance for augmentation is his fatal flaw, but in a world as unfair as Cyberpunk's, the only way to get to the top is through risking everything. Now that I think of it, Deus Ex Human Revolution had a pretty strong Icarian theme to it as well, didn't it? I guess Icarus pops up a lot in Cyberpunk narratives, little Greek bastard. That shouldn't be too harsh. It must be tough to literally have the concept of forgetting your limits and failing horribly once you exceed them be synonymous with your name. Then again, he's a fictional character, so it probably isn't actually that tough after all. Really, it's dramatic irony at its most intense. We know how it'll end long before the characters do, and it gives the whole run this feeling of bittersweet, often just bitter melancholy. A lot of these characters are genuinely good people pushed to do terrible things to themselves and others just to keep their heads above the water, and it's brutal seeing them unable to or unwilling to accept their descent. I think that's why the show is so resonant. It doesn't pull its punches. There's no fairy tale ending because Night City is too bleak a place for that. It really hits the cyberpunk nail on the head, unfortunately driven into David's coffin. Alright, that one was a little bleak. That's kind of a bummer ending, isn't it? Usually I'm revving up the fun music so I can leave on a nice positive stinger. Man, I'm feeling a little melancholic myself after all of that. You need to pick me up. I'm gonna go play Burnout 3.
David! No!